Thank you very much for your invitation and for giving us the floor to be able to speak about bookbinding. It's always a pleasure to be able to do so. And of course, it's a special pleasure to be able to do so with so many people online to listen to us. We're very happy to talk about two parallel collections owned by two not particularly important people of the 16th century, but who were able to put together very important and long-lasting libraries, which will be at the heart of what we shall talk about. They have some very coherent elements about them and some divergent ones. But of course, the first element of coherence is the fact that they were both owned and used within a geographic space, which is that of the 16th century Netherlands, and they were both people who came from the Dutch world, one in Utrecht and one in Amsterdam. Uh, the 16th century Netherlands were, of course, a space which was particularly propitious to the development of this sort of large collection that they were able to put together. It was a space where the book was an important item. It is put forward in things such as we see here, adverts for the new universities. It is also something which even though Dutch publishing hadn't quite achieved the status it would during the 17th century, it was a place where people exchanged books and had easy access to books made all over Europe. This built also on the prosperity of the Dutch nation and, of course, on the importance of reading to the people in that space. It was, of course, a period of intense difficulty. It was one of religious strife, of a subdivision of the geographic space of the Low Countries, definition of a new nation, and also one of danger and danger to people, but also, as we shall see, danger to books as well, and danger to collections. If the Utrecht and Amsterdam bases, of which both our protagonists were, never had to put up with sacks such as Antwerp and Mechelen had to during the 16th century. Nevertheless, they both had to encounter members of opposite factions, and this will leave also an important trace in the history that we shall be telling you about today. Of course, within all that, we're particularly interested not just in the collections, but in the bindings and what the bindings can tell us about the collection and how they interacted together. And this interest in book bindings, of course, doesn't build on nothing but on a series of works which have, over the last decade or so, started to enhance our knowledge of bookbinding collections and the Dutch world.
We wanted to show you a few of the recent monographs that were published on such collections, even if you're not necessarily familiar with those types of collections or aren't able to read Dutch, because these publications are so far only in Dutch. For instance, there have been a lot of research done on librairies, so on libraries in churches in the Netherlands, such as two monographs published in the past years on the library, the library of the Church of Zutphen and the one in Enkhuizen. But there had already been research also done on private collections or individual collections in the past in the Netherlands, especially by Bert van Selm, who did a study of auction catalogues of private libraries being sold from the beginning of the 17th century in the Netherlands. As the Netherlands, as many of you know, were a place where such auction catalogues were published at a very early stage. there is also a well-known study, or a study of a well-known library, the one by Theseus in Leiden, also an early 17th century library, which attracted attention and again has been the object of several books recently. However, we are talking here of private collections from the 17th century. So the two collections we're going to talk about today are 16th century private collections, and that is also an element that is very interesting and renewing what already had been done on such private collections and on city collections and public collections in the Netherlands. We have to mention, of course, and that's the manuscript fragments you see on screen, that research has been done before on the Van Buchel collection by Bart Jaski, who is among us today, who started studying the manuscript fragments in the bindings, on which Malcolm will talk about. And on the other hand, one of my predecessors at the special collections of the University Library of Amsterdam, Kees Gnerp, also studied extensively the Buik collection. Unfortunately, didn't publish the results of his research extensively, but some of it has been integrated by Jos Biemans in his book on the early stages of what have become the special collections of the University of Amsterdam when it was still a city library. And these are, again, also fundaments on which we could build this research we're now going to present to you. So we're going to start with some elements on the biographies of Van Buchel and of Buik, as they are very important to understand the construction, the building of their libraries. On the left side, you have a portrait of Hubert van Buchel, and on the right side, one of Jacob Buik. And to start with Hubert van Buchel, of which the portrait is still in possession of the University Library of Utrecht. One important element to know is that he came from originally a family from German nobility, but he was born in Utrecht, where he spent part of his life, although another city is very important in his life, Cologne, where he studied. So he went from Utrecht to Cologne to study, came back to Utrecht, where he became a canon, and later in his life traveled again to Cologne, as well. Explain more in details later on. He became, after his studies, the canon of the St. Mary Church in Utrecht in 1536, and spent several years of his life in Utrecht before he left when the city was under the control of the Spanish troops of the Spanish emperor. When we look at his life on this chronology, we see that he had quite a long life, which means that he also had a long time to amass a vast collection of books. The period in which he may have been acquired books can start roughly in his study time up until the moment he died in 1600. So that's also an important fact to know to understand how this collection can evolve in time. In parallel, we have Jacob Buik, who was born in Amsterdam, and of whom we have a portrait that was done later in his life, and that he's kept also in an Amsterdam museum, Allard, in the attic, very close to the Allard Pierson. Jacob Buik was born in Amsterdam also from a wealthy family. He grew up in Amsterdam and went to Leuven to study theology, and then went back to Amsterdam to become a priest in the Old Church of Amsterdam. And that's where he stayed until he too had to leave the city because of religious reasons, this time when Amsterdam became a Protestant city in 1578. And here you have, again, on his chronology, the period in which the important elements of his life are to be seen, and where we can also see the moments where he could collect books. He lived not didn't live such a long life as Hubert van Buchel, but still had also ample time to collect books, as you can see here. And when you put the chronologies in parallel, you see that many of those elements are very comparable, although an important aspect was that their religion sympathies were quite opposite. But you can see that they both studied at university, had a prebend in a church, had to leave their home city and leave for exile roughly around the same period, and die in another city. And exile, I think, is one important element to take into account to understand how they forged their book collections.
Their exile, of course, was done in different places. Both went into exile, as it were, in areas which were sympathetic to their original religious leanings. They were both in the Catholic Church, a canon and a priest. And of course, when Van Buchel went to Cologne, he went back to a city he already knew, and one which was also still a Catholic city in those days. And this means that both of them made choices which left them outside of the Dutch world, having started their book collection within the Dutch space, and therefore having to develop it, make it bigger, but also then send it back to the Dutch space afterwards. If we look at this map showing, broadly speaking, the division of territory as it was in the 17th century, but which is very similar to what it was at their death in 1599, we can see that both of them made choices which didn't really send them to areas which were very far removed from their origins. Boyk went to the Duchy of Cleves, which is immediately up against the Dutch border along the Rhine, and Hubert van Buchel went back to the city where he had first of all been to university, and indeed was therefore able to find a city which he already knew. They both, beyond their proximity to the Netherlands, share the fact that they're both along the Rhine. And this, of course, is a very important part of the story, since the development of the book world was one which was intricately linked to the movement of books along rivers, and the Rhine served as an important way for boats and goods and books amongst them to move through Europe and beyond. Here, therefore, they would have had easy access to books moving forward and backwards along the Rhine Valley, but also themselves could keep in touch with what was going on more broadly in the politics and social world of the Netherlands. People like Hubert van Buchel kept their house and also other properties in Utrecht all the while. Nevertheless, it is worth pointing out here a stark difference. Hubert van Buchel went to a major city, Cologne, which had its own book industry, a publishing centre, but also one which was very important in terms of the exchange of goods and the exchange of books. Whilst in Cleves, Boyk had chosen an area which was less influential and depended more on what could come from elsewhere. And this is the first part of what we need to understand about them, is that the way in which they acquired books was therefore going to naturally be different. A difference also predicated on the fact that Van Buchel made a choice to go over to the Protestant religion, or leastwise in his personal beliefs, without letting go of his canon seat. And on the other side, we have Boyk, who remains very much a Catholic, and this again will influence their decisions. Both Boyk and Van Buchel will have spent all their lives in the very center of the production areas of books during their lifetimes. The square which you see on the screen is one within which the vast majority of books throughout the world were produced in this period, and they were sold from there elsewhere through systems of distribution, which were both sophisticated and for the time rapid. But nevertheless, of course, when you lived so closely within this area, you had an easy access to a wide variety of books. And this variety of books is something we shall see in their collections as they develop it, but also they can choose where they shall take their influences, both for the books they have, but also for the bindings that they will develop from there. There are, of course, many ways in which they could acquire their books, and indeed, it would be dangerous to try and suggest that there was a single way in which the collections were formed, not least since we're talking about thousands of different books. And this would therefore give us a overly simplified vision of how book collections were put together. Books were bought for secondhand, they were bought new, they were also given, they were passed on. And in this case, we see one of the books given by Plantin to Van Boegel in 1580. And of course, the way in which the book came, whether it was already pre-bound or not, means that we have to be fairly careful when evaluating some of these collections. We do know, however, by looking at the traces they've left, both inside the books and outside of them, that they had very different acquisition strategies. And these strategies, in turn, will show us how they understand their book collections and will influence how they also make their bindings and have bindings, therefore, in their collection afterwards. Van Boegel was clearly mainly a buyer of new books. He followed very closely the market. He acquired books throughout his long life, and he acquired mainly contemporary books to his own production. We know this from the marks he left in the books, from the evolution in styles, and we'll come back to that over time in the creation of the books, but also by looking at some of the books themselves, and in particular his collection of the catalogues of the Frankfurt Fair. Over his life, he collected, or at least we have 20 different copies of the various autumn and spring Frankfurt fairs. And he didn't simply collect them and keep them, he annotated them. And he annotated them in such a way that we are able to follow his interest with different types of marginal remarks. Sometimes he would underline them, sometimes he would put these sort of slashes, either in the external or the internal margins. Underlining and internal margin slashes have a signification which seems to be broadly the same, which is that these were books he was particularly interested in. Whether this was the basis for buying them or a basis for acknowledging that he already had them is a moot point for the whole of the collection. Nevertheless, by looking at the catalogues of 1582, for example, we are able to trace in the catalogue which was produced in 1608 of the first books that were integrated into the university library, that he had owned at least 2/3 of the books which are marked in this way. It seems most probable that these were ways of finding out about new books and buying them at that point. The marks on the outside, however, seem very rarely to refer back to books which he has in his collection. It is around 4 to 5% from the ones I've been able to check. So clearly here we have more of an intellectual interaction with the objects, and indeed when he marks these books, sometimes he will correct the entries, he will add information about them. We know of his interest in all these things, since sometimes, for example, when he underlines them, like we find here, we have additional information. And here we have, for example, the indication of the price of the book indicated here, as well as an address where it could be found. The book is in his collection today. It has a price which, and it's noteworthy, is in albus rather than in any of the more current currencies used in Frankfurt. The albus was the coin of Cologne, and therefore suggests some local buying after his decision to move into exile after 1571. Above it, there's an indication, which is that of a street, which we can find on the 1571 Mercator engraving. It is just here off the old market, and clearly was the place where he was going to acquire the book, or had acquired the book for the 13 albus we've seen. So we see the development of a coherent buying strategy, one which is linked to the acquisition of new books rather than older books, though in some cases we do have proof of previous ownership. These are rare amongst his books, and the vast majority do not have any other marks than those associated with him. This is in stark contrast to the attitude developed by Boyk.
Here you see a manuscript catalogue that Boyk made of his library. He wrote this catalogue. He made it from 1575 to 1589, which means that it doesn't cover the whole period during which he bought books, since he died about 10 years after he stopped registering books in his catalogue. And this is a catalogue that allowed, as I was saying, Kees Knierp, who did the work of retracing the books of Boyk to catalogue them in the current catalogue of the University Library. It's allowed to retrace the books that were still in possession of the library and the ones that may have disappeared. In this catalogue, we see also that Boyk mentions that some of his books were lost, namely the books he bought while he was a student in Leuven. It starts with this mention, the heretics in Latin, of course. The heretics had burnt all my joys, my books, but God gave them back in greater numbers, which means that he lost his books when he came back from Leuven, when he was moving back to Amsterdam to start his function as a priest of the old church. However, despite this lack in his collection, he managed to again accrue it in time and to register those titles, most of his titles for the periods I mentioned in the catalogue. I'm going to very briefly mention here how the catalogue works, and I'll get back to the catalogues later on in the presentation. There are two layers of registering books, one that starts in Amsterdam and that you can see with the ink that is in a darker color and with larger letters. And there is a second period in which he starts also registering the books he acquires while he has moved to the Duchy of Cleve. The interesting thing is that, as Malcolm was mentioning, it is not only a system in which books are bought from booksellers as new items. In this catalogue, we can retrace a lot of mentions in which we see that books are acquired from other people, but also sometimes, such as in this case, books are also given to other people, or in this case, to the cross-bearers of Emmerich. He has many Bibles in his possession, and he decides in 1586 to give one of them to the library of this association because they lacked a Bible. So we see here another kind of system of acquiring or indeed also giving away books than just by buying them at a bookseller. So we have two very different collections, and I'm going to briefly here present some of the features of this collection before we go on to our main topic today, which is the bindings themselves. First, the collection of Van Buchel. These numbers are not based on the editions that are still, or the titles are still in possession of the University Library of Utrecht nowadays. but on a catalogue that was made in 1608 for the City Library of Utrecht, in which all the Van Buchel books were indicated with B, because his collection was actually the biggest collection that came into the City Library at the beginning of the 17th century. And indeed, it was most of the collection of the City Library when the catalogue was made in 1608. So we can retrace more than 3,000 editions, which, as you can see here, 6 categories that are the ones of the catalogue of the library at the time. We may today attribute the types of books, the thematics of books maybe slightly differently, but this gives you an idea of his collection, with obviously a very large part devoted to theology. But it's very important to also note that there are other titles with quite an important part devoted to history, both old ancient history and contemporary history, in which you can actually also find a lot of books which are devoted to travel descriptions and descriptions of other parts of the world, and not just historical events. And for a smaller part, medicine, and then a very little part for philosophy, literature, and law. Again, this being based on the books that were recorded in 1608, which also, Malcolm will give an example, not necessarily cover some of the books that were in the possession of Van Buchel, but that were not recorded in this catalogue. And one important feature of the books regarding theology is that these are works of Protestant theology and Reformation pamphlets. And indeed, they really show the interest of Van Buchel, as Malcolm mentioned, for the Protestant theology, although he was brought up in a Catholic environment and had a function earlier in his life as a Catholic canon. And another important point to note is that the biggest part, or at least more than about the half of the titles are here recorded, come from cities of the Holy Roman Empire in terms of production of the titles, and from Switzerland, or current-day Switzerland, and that only a small part of his books were produced in France, in the Low Countries, both southern and northern Low Countries, or other cities, such as, for instance, Italian cities. By contrast, I see we're missing a few numbers here. Malcolm is having a, yes, thank you very much. In contrast, the collection of Beck is smaller. Here I also have to say that these are numbers that I still need to check more thoroughly, because they are based on the numbers and the title list I could gather from our current catalogue, digital catalogue of the University Library of Amsterdam, which unfortunately for some technical reasons sometimes counts some titles double. But roughly the collection of Beck is of about 1,000 titles, in which, as you can see, the part of theology is even bigger than in the collection of Van Buchel. And if history is also present, it is in a much smaller part, just as the other categories of the collection. So really the focal point of Beck was much more theology, even more than Van Buchel. And in his case, these are almost exclusively works of Catholic theology and liturgy, which he used very clearly to annotate his books, especially for his use as a priest, since he was a priest in Amsterdam, but he remained a priest when he was in Cleve, and he also took care of another Catholic community while he was there. So that is very much to see in the type of titles you now find in his catalogue and lists. As for the provenance, we see here a big difference. Malcolm mentioned it already. Although they live in a space that is quite similar, the provenance of the editions is quite different, in the sense that even if the Holy Roman Empire still is one of the big centers in which the books he owned were produced. The other big centers of production are the Low Countries, and especially Antwerp. Antwerp is really one of the very big printing centers from which he gets his book. France is also one of the places, especially Paris and Lyon are the two big printing centers from which also part of his collection comes from. And I'm going to let Malcolm get to what you are all waiting for, namely the binding types.
Thank you very much. So, of course, now that you have a sort of broad picture of the collection and you understand how these two men put together these extraordinarily large and interesting collections with both theological elements in them, but very different, both in terms of provenance and origins. Let's dive into the actual bindings and look at them more closely. And we'll start for that with the collection of Hubert van Boegel, whose collection is perhaps the most diverse in terms of the variety, simply in part because of the number of volumes involved. And you can see that there's quite a variety of different types of rollers and decoration being used, a lot of which contains information which can be used to try and better understand the confection and choices made for the bindings which were owned by Van Boegel. You see here a whole host of different rollers with some of that information. We have on the one hand information about dates, ranging, as you can see, from the 1530s to the 1550s in terms of the dates on the rollers, sometimes quite well hidden in some of the decoration. And you also have here some initials which refer more to the makers of the rollers. And it ranges from some we find more than once. We see MH here, and we find it also here down at the bottom. Some other ones is NP, HT, WL here, and so forth. This is all very interesting information and brings a certain coherence to certain parts of the collection, but it's also very treacherous in terms of its usage and its importance. Decoration on its own, of course, is not a very good guide always for understanding bindings. And here, especially since the data which is given, both dates and names, are those who made the rollers rather than those who actually necessarily bound the books. The dates are termino postquem, so moments after which the bindings could have been made, which of course is useful information for understanding, especially someone with a long life like Van Boegel, when the bindings were done for him. And then you have these letters, which in some cases, such as here, for example, clearly referred to the maker of the rollers and not to the booksellers who might be binding the books, though of course in some cases this might be the same person. Very often, and that is what most scholarship says, that if you are looking for the name of a bookseller in such elements, they're often spelled out in full, and you'll see an example of that later, though not in the collection of Van Boegel. In other cases, when you only have initials, it is often only when they are the central focus, such as here, that perhaps we can trust them more to be something about the bookseller rather than the maker. And this is something we need to bear in mind as we advance on this difficult way in which we have to use this material, which is nevertheless, of course, extremely useful. And it does reflect something which we find in the collection, which is obvious, is that though we have this variety, we do have clear groups within this variety. It isn't a one-offs, generally speaking, which we find in one or other of these elements. And they do have a visual similarity to a lot of them. Here you see a selection of volumes made for Van Boekel. And you can see that they do share a lot of very simple visual traits in terms of structure, the number of supports being used, the material with which they're made, but some variety, such as, for example, here parchment bindings, as well as the others. And one of the things that when we delve into and look at these bindings more clearly is we do see an evolution over time. We see that the way in which the books are bound goes through a whole series of moments of development. So here we have, for example, one of the very early bindings made for Van Boekel, which features rather happily his name at the top, but also, as you can see here, the letters WL. It is a very clearly a Dutch made binding with Dutch materials in it. But this, of course, is only one small facet of what is made for him. And actually, we have comparatively few bindings from the start of Van Boekel's life and career as a book collector. And it is far more in later periods that we shall start to find coherent collections. As I said, we will. What I'm going to present is not just trusting what I find in the decorative elements, though they do have this coherence I was talking about. There's also important evidence coming from the paper used in the fly leaves and in the paste downs, with paper which comes sometimes from Basel, sometimes more from the further in Germanic world, if we can call it that, and sometimes from the French world. Here's a good example of French paper making its way into, in this case, Dutch binding via, therefore, the production of Simon Nivelle, who was a paper maker in the Champagne area. He was the official maker for paper for the University of Paris, which is why, as you can see perhaps on the left here, if we take two of the flies at the start of the end of the book, which were pasted down originally, you can see here the start and the end of the watermark with the name Simon Nivelle at the bottom, and at the top the arms of the University of Paris with the hand of God handing down the book to the world of the French. A nice symbol that's nevertheless used elsewhere. This is high quality paper, expensive paper, and shows good investments in the structures. We do find different types of paper being used in the different periods, in the different places, and this is also very good evidence. There's also other evidence which comes from the money spent and the investments made, and that is something that I'll come back to, but is very important corroborative information which enables us to be sure where books were produced. There are also wider things beyond the actual material used, and that is, of course, the layout and the way in which the books are worked. We have some very old systems with the traditional Flemish slash Low Country system of dividing up the decoration into lozenges. And then we also find this, what you see on the screen, this older way of separating out the layout into two sections. This was something which you found also when you have plaque stamped bindings where they doubled the same elements of decoration on the top and the bottom half. This is something which is broadly abandoned as the 16th century goes on. And indeed, these early elements all seem to come with other corroboration that tells us these are Dutch-made bindings. As we go towards the more traditionally 16th century, middle to late 16th century styles, there's no surprise to find that we find them mainly with some of the German elements, and we'll come to that later. More surprising and less obvious, we do find a fair number of parchment bindings in the collection of Van Buchel, but the vast majority, and almost exclusively those which we can tell Van Buchel himself had made rather than been given or having received, they all seem to date from this first period, the Dutch period. They don't have imprints which go beyond the 1560s within them, which of course is the important moment where in 1571 he goes to Cologne, which suggests he's no longer receiving books and no longer having books made for him in this way. And the style of the making of these parchment bindings is very much reminiscent of what you find mainly in the Low Countries rather than in the Germanic world. And this is something we will also talk about when we'll move over and look at our other hero of the day, as we will find something which actually is very close in terms, in stylistic terms, of how these bindings are made. We also find in this early period of Utrecht bindings stamped rolls and stamps, sorry, which have dating evidence on them, which is early dating evidence. Here we have some 1539 usage. It's worth saying that the vast majority of these rollers seem to have already a certain age when they're used on a lot of the bindings. Of course, the bindings have suffered the from their use, from the fact that they've been rubbed against other volumes over time. But often, less obvious here because I took this one because we can read the date, but often we find that the mark of these rollers isn't quite as clear as could have been in its earlier days. We also find the 1545 dating linked in the same roller to the letters MH, often identified with a Utrecht binder who has the same initials, Michael Henrici, but which is perhaps something which is worth pointing forward with nevertheless a word of warning, as that I already made. And then when we go over to the German period, we find that for a lot of the bindings, there is a similarity in terms of the presentation of the bindings. Van Boel continues to get them made from leather which is tanned in dark brown. And which is covered with rollers, but which does have, of course, a change of material, but seems to be using material which is no longer the most recent material on a lot of these boards. So, for example, we see these 1557 rollers. This is the date you can see here, either side of the head of St. Paul. And these are found virtually exclusively on bindings dated after 1571 and seem to stop completely in 1587, after which there's a move to a different type of roller in the usage. So we see here a coherence in the stylistic choices made by Van Buchel with these very distinctive, heavily decorated volumes in this dark brown tanned leather with a way of presenting books which does keep the broadly lower Rhine stylistic choices, but which nevertheless shows this difference between what we find in the Dutch world and the German world. And we find the same thing in some of the simpler bindings he also has made. There are two types of painted parchment bindings. Here, rather than being used without boards, as we saw earlier, here we have examples using cardboard boards around which the parchment is placed. They are painted. Nevertheless, there are clear differences in between two styles of these painted parchment volumes. The first is the one used in the Dutch period, often marked by smaller elements of pointed decoration, either just in the corners, sometimes in the center, sometimes absent, but with the use of certain quality of parchment, which sets it aside from what we find more in the German period, where you find heavily the reuse of material, the use also of a different system of ties being used, and you can see here that the painting doesn't leave the same effect either. So even in the very simple bindings, we can see these different choices. So we have both different choices made in terms of making some books into high quality rollered bindings, decorated, and others much simpler. If we turn to someone like Van Eyck, we find a very different choice being made. Here, on the other hand, what is predominant in his collection are these very simple bindings with this parchment, with a host of different systems of ties and of supports lacing through, as you can see on this photo, some similarities and some very different techniques. But with a choice which clearly goes more towards this type of binding as the binding of choice for his usage. Of course, it doesn't mean he doesn't have other types. As Katell underlined earlier, his acquisition of books is more varied. He has a lot of books which he receives. He buys a lot of books secondhand rather than new. And because of that, he has a wide variety of different decorative styles in his decorated bindings. But if we try and see a book as being a typical book from the Boyke collection, it is more this sort of item. Something covered with parchment, often with a lot of parchment material protecting it, either here with a full wraparound, tying in here with a clasp, which we find in a number of his bindings, which of course allows books to be manipulated, taken, moved a lot with, but always maintaining their structural integrity, and which therefore make very ample use of parchment. So though parchment can be seen as a cheaper material very often than the more expensive tanned finish that the books of Van Boekel have, this isn't actually a cheap way. He's not looking for the cheapest type of binding by doing it. He is using this material or getting the binders to use the material in a rather liberal fashion, as you can see with all this area of wraparound, which is not strictly necessary for the binding. Note here also that at the head and at the bottom, the amount of parchment being used is such that it actually goes beyond the text block quite considerably, and therefore affords it protection to the edges, both at the top and the bottom. And even when we don't find these wraparounds, consistently you find that the material used is wider than the text block and therefore also protects it in that way. And this idea of someone actually paying for simple bindings, but actually protecting the text rather well, is something you find when you delve into the back of the bindings and you stare down at the sewing which has been done. And very consistently, you find in the Boyke collection all along sewing at a time where in many other simple bindings, you're going to find people who are going to do various types of simplified sewing, whether it is jumping from one gathering to another or going well, not one and not every single one of the supports, but jumping supports instead. And indeed, in the one or two bindings which with time have surrendered their parchment covers, you can see just how well the sewing has been done. These are structurally very sound. They allow very heavy usage. And clearly, this is something, therefore, which isn't simply a cheap binding, it is considered perhaps more a functional binding. And certainly, this seems to be something which suggests that there is a clear thought process going on from these owners who are determining what sort of bindings they want with very different choices between them for a use which, as you've seen, can be quite similar, which is that of heavy reading of theology books in particular. And this allows us to think about the relationship of these owners to the books through their bindings. Now, we have quite a lot of evidence for this in both these cases, both from the catalogue for Buik, but also for in the case of Van Boerel, from the books themselves. Van Boerel quite systematically noted the cost of the binding at the back of the book. In some cases, the fly leaves have been replaced and this information has been lost through restoration or through damage. But in most cases, we do have this information, and this gives us a clear hierarchy of costs, with the cheapest ones being the parchment bindings of this type. This one, for example, costs just 2 stivers, fairly cheap binding, comparatively at least in the material used. Whilst in the later bindings, the ones in Germany, we find the price also inscribed, but often with even more detail, as you can see just here. And before I move on, you'll see here reused material. I'll come back to that in a minute. These indications that we find here on the back flyleaf give us the price of the binding in albus, which is, as I said, the coinage of Cologne. This is the coins used. They are worth slightly less than the stover, as an albus is worth about 2/3 of a stover or thereabouts, depending. We have one or two moments when Van Boerel himself makes the conversion between the two. It also tells us how many different editions have been integrated into the same binding, and afterwards tells us the number of choirs or gatherings which have been put together. Here you can see it's quite a substantial number, 102. And this enables us, therefore, to see the relationship between the amount of sewing necessary, the work needed in order to put together the binding, and allows us to start to project also the investment made by Van Boerel in his books, as well as try and chart the evolution during the period of this. And I've just put together very quickly some stats for 40 of the volumes, but there are many more to do over the Cologne period. And you can see that it is broadly, this is based on the last date of the book in the binding, and I'll come back to the actual binding dates of the book a bit later. But you can see it's broadly flat, especially for the first period, though that can be explained in a minute, and indeed only sees a small incremental increase over the last 30 years of the century in terms of how much is being paid per binding in similar types of binding for the putting together of multiple choirs. So cost was of interest to Van Boerel is something we can see through this quite careful annotation of the book, but also through the reuse of a lot of the of other material in the bindings, in particular in the paste downs, which you find at the start and the end of the text block up against the boards. Here we find a lot of reused medieval manuscripts. The work by Bartiaski shows that they come for the vast majority from his own church in Utrecht. And what is interesting about this is you find them in the books bound in Utrecht, but you also find them in great quantities in the books bound in Cologne, which means that he's taking with him a number of these manuscripts, or leastwise parts of these manuscripts, over to Cologne. And we know it's part of the manuscripts because sometimes we have other parts of the same manuscript which haven't been ripped up in order to make this and which still survive in Utrecht, if I am not making a mistake. But Bart will correct me if I am. This process is interesting because it tells us something about the way in which he's working, the way in which he's trying not just to keep this material and reduce cost, but actually how he's keeping the texts themselves. And this can be gleaned in particular from the places in which some of these are coming off. And here we see that he is willing to use all sorts of material from all sorts of backgrounds. We've seen some medieval manuscripts, but here we have some more ordinary parchment in many ways, used in simply an official act, one which involves no one else than himself. Here you can see Bert van Buchel from Hubert van Buchel, and we can see him named as here a canon of St. Mary in Utrecht. But you'll also note up here a very interesting indication, which is if you can read it, indicating the number of quires and the number of parts that you actually find in the book that comes after. This is not the indication where he explains the price or the way in which the book was put together. It is a way of indicating content. Something which is kept within the parchment. And this is something we find in a number of copies in these places. This is a particularly interesting one for a number of reasons. The first is you can see at the top the indication Bucho up here, which indicates that this is done in a way where the books, the printed sheets inside them, could be mistaken for being someone else's. So they're not just about the way in which he's keeping them and using them at home, but also the way in which they are being transported to the booksellers, since they're being kept in this way, and that the person to whom they're supposed to go back to is indicated very precisely. But we also see underneath that beyond indications we've seen of the number of gatherings or parts, we also have titles here and years. And if we look very carefully, we can transcribe it and work out that in this case, for example, it is a reference to a 1573 almanac printed in Zurich, which in fact is a part of a series of Schreib almanacs produced in the late 1560s and 1570s, and refers to probably an item which was on the inside. Here, what is interesting is that the reuse of this material isn't done immediately in the binding of the work which is named on the outside, since the work which is named here, this almanac, is not in the actual book as it survives today. Now, this is important because it suggests, therefore, that this is a way of stocking books, both for Van Buchel and in Van Buchel's own collection, but also when they go to a binder, but they're not systematically used one-on-one, i.e. you're not using necessarily the folder on the binding which makes the book afterwards, but it's just being used as material help on a series of them, which suggests, therefore, that multiple items are being bound simultaneously, and we'll come back to that. It's also worth noting this almanac is no longer to be found in the collection, either in the library today, or in the 1608 catalogue, or indeed anywhere in the world, since we don't know any copies of the 1573 edition of this almanac today. But we all know that almanacs are meant to be used, and after a while, well, reused, whether for pepper with oysters or in some other way, certainly not for conservation, which makes, of course, this folder situation particularly interesting. And this, it can be linked into the way in which we know that Van Bommel used the books, since his annotations, which some of which you find here, are numerous, and very often they go right into the margins, which show that actually he's reading the books as sheets, as made together gatherings, rather than in the bindings in which they are as we know them today. And we can see the desire of Van Bommel to interact and to organize these books when they are being made in a way which makes sense to him. And you can see this sometimes in areas which are not supposed to survive. In particular, here at the bottom of the title pages, you can see here the indication A1. The second part has the indication A2. The third part has nothing because it's been cut off. And you can just see right at the bottom the indication here A4, for which we have the A and the start of the 4 at the bottom here, which show that the organization of the work is being done, that these Sammelbände are not being created just by throwing books together, but the conservation of these works is important. And we can, I think, see that these books, therefore, these bindings are thought of by Van Bommel as conservation systems rather than use in the way that he was going to read them. We can also see the way in which he's thinking about these in the fact that even the decorations sometimes answer the content. I like this example because these are 3 items in a series on texts on government, which he's kept, and there is one by Machiavelli, and the one which only contains a work by Machiavelli is which one? Well, I'm sure you've all guessed. It's this one down here. Since it's the only work written by a Florentine, it's the only one that gets the fleur-de-lis of Florence with its very distinctive elements which differentiate it from the French classic fleur-de-lis. And this, of course, therefore goes on to what? It goes on to be exactly the description of the content, but in a different way. And this shows choice, and this shows the depth of thinking going on in the choice of these elements. This is also true, of course, with Van Bommel, but in a different way.
So for Buik, I'll be a bit quicker now because having a look at the time, I know we have to, of course, leave time for questions and discussion afterwards. For Buik, if we get back to the catalogue and having a look at the screen. So again, I was mentioning this system in which we can see when we look and zoom in on the details that he lists the books that he buys, that we also find interesting details on which books he buys in which form. If you look again at the details, you see, for instance, here that he mentions a book that he bought in membranis. So that's with the parchment binding Malcolm showed us earlier, for which he writes down a price. And given the date, you can see indeed that there's a big difference between the date in which the book was printed and the moment where Buik acquired it. And then if you look at another example, you see on the contrary that some books are bound with a hardcover, if you will, such as we saw also in the library of Van Buchel, cum claustris, so with the locks indicating that they are closing a sturdy volume, which in this case has also mention of where he bought it in Embrikij in Emmerich. So there we can see a book that he bought while he was writing Cleve. And I still have to reconstruct more carefully from the catalogue all those different mentions of prices. But you've seen that with also what Van Buchel mentions of prices sometimes in Stuyver. It could be, I think, possible to also figure out in which cases the price is indicated with or without a binding. But it's actually very interesting to see to reconstruct the financial aspects of what Buik pays for his different books. Just a very few examples, however, of books for which we know he bought them secondhand, and there again having a very different attitude to the one from Van Buchel, buying books that he's going to acquire from people, such as here, in which he indicates in a flyleaf that he bought his book so that he could soothe the discomforts of a sad life because he had just been forced to emigrate to Emmerich. You can see it also on the date that it is above the short strophe, the short poem above, with a date which is actually about a month after he had to leave Amsterdam. And on the below mention, an excerpt from his catalogue, which again he mentions as a book bought in Emmerich while being in exile. But if you look at this book more carefully, you see that, so the mentions are here quite clear about the books he buys this way in different places. This is also the case of other books in which, in this case, we have mentions of previous owners. This one, for instance, was from a certain Bernardus Basilius, who was the rightful owner, a mention that Buik left when he bought the book secondhand. Another example is this one with clearly an earlier binding than what we could see earlier. In this case, we have a name on the binding, which indicates a certain André Boule. We will get back to him. But if we open the book and we look at the flyleaf, we see a mention of a previous owner, Albertus Johannes, a pastor in Amsterdam, buying this book in Leuven in 1556. And if we go to the title page, we see that there are more indications again of this sort of pentagram or star with AIP, which also refers to Albertus Johannes, priest, pastor. And we can then reconstruct the story of this book, which was bound by André Boule, who was not necessarily, probably not previous owner, but actually a bookbinder. We know he was a bookbinder active in Paris between 1500 and 1523, which means that quite probably this book was made first for a first owner in Paris before it was bought by Albertus Johannes in Leuven in 1556. Before, again, it was bought or given to Jacob Buik, probably in Amsterdam, since Albertus Johannes was active as a priest in Amsterdam later on. Another example is this one, again, a binding that could mean that it was made for Buik, but when we look at the provenance, we see that it was owned previously by a certain Lambertus Vertenus, under which Buik adds with his own handwriting that he bought it in Emmerich. So here we have a case of Buik buying a book from someone else, also indicating how much he paid for the book and where he bought it. Whereas when we go to the next example, we see with, again, provenances and with the indications here that it was a book of Henricus Peronius, priest in Kalka, so also enclave close to Emmerich. Peronius indicates the date in which he buys the book, and then Buik adds, so in 1576, and Buik adds that he buys the book of Peronius after this man has died. So he bought the book from the library of the deceased in 1588. And then finally, another example of, again, a very different type of binding, with, in this case, another provenance that gives us as indication that, again, Buik writes, I bought this book together with a dictionary of French from the books of the deceased husband of the woman who wrote her name in the book, Gertrude Bergs called Van Willac. So we have here a book that was owned apparently by two people conjointly, a man and or husband and wife, from which Buik finally bought this book. So these are interesting ways of transmission that show a very different circuit of circulation in which Buik really was open to buying books previously owned by other people, less in this case interested in the type of bindings they had, but quite practically just looking for titles that were important for him to own. So what happens to the book as a conclusion very quickly? We evoked the libraries in which they have been kept today. In one case, again, the books entered the library, the city library of Utrecht, after the death of Van Buchel, because he had made a will to give his library to the city, which is why we have this catalogue, which I mentioned earlier, in which we also have the collections of another donator, Evert van der Pol, and they are indicated in those initials, either B or P. So B are all the books that were coming from the Van Buchel collection. And again, as I was saying, more than 3,000 entries.
And what is interesting here is we can therefore try and see how the books have been transformed, how things have been transformed to better understand their original state, and to take into account also what may be original appropriation or later appropriation, trying to understand when the title was being put on, when also elements such as the shelf mark was put on, but also the evolution of shelf marks, which show us how the collection was integrated and changed through the years, and also, of course, how things can be transformed. Here, for example, coloured after the arrival in the library on the edges in a very 17th century Dutch manner, but also, as you can see here, that certain items were ripped out, either to be put separately or to simply be deaccessioned, to be weeded out of the original collection. And this means that reconstructing the history of the library is looking at these elements, but also therefore looking at all the other pieces of information that together can give us an understanding about its history. And sometimes this also means seeing things which don't look as if they have anything to do with our collection, and then turning them around and seeing that actually they used to be together, even though they are no longer today.
In the case of the Buik collection, when he died, he actually donated his library to his inheritors, to his family. But the books were finally, about 20 years, a bit less than 20 years after his death, integrated with other collections of the City Library of Amsterdam. However, as you can see here, the catalogue, the first catalogue that was made of the City Library was made in 1622. That is to say, before the collection of Buik was integrated into it, which is why we don't have such a detailed catalogue as the one that was made for the Utrecht Library. And the collection was integrated into the University Library of Amsterdam, which is to be seen on some volumes. The bigger ones, which contain theological works that could be used within the library of the university, show, for instance, here, if you can't see it clearly now, you will maybe notice it, signs that those books were chained in two different places, hence a first time and then a second time. And if you look at this volume, you see it even more clearly. However, most of the books were not chained. They were probably more kept in boxes or in cases. Very few of the books have been restored and given a new binding, as was the case that happened more with the Van der Pol collection, because it kept being used in the university library for a longer time. However, in the case of the Buik collection, because it was a Catholic collection of Catholic theology, it is very clear that only very few volumes were interesting for the university library in a Protestant city such as Amsterdam in the early 17th century, which explains why very few of the books show intensive use of traces of intensive use, or even had to be restored. That's the case of this volume, which is one of the exceptions I've seen with a very modern restoration, with 20th century restoration, unfortunately. But you see that even when they have been restored, many elements have been kept, such as in this case, also interesting elements of two titles in this book, with in total 4 titles, which were bought in Cologne. So that gives us again another layer of information on how sometimes Belk could acquire titles from Cologne, have them being brought to Clave and being bound for him, even though unfortunately we now have a modern binding. But this way we see again that this is a collection that presents on the whole many volumes that haven't been touched, even if, as Malcolm mentioned, sometimes the parchment binding have become loose in time. But luckily, thanks to the very strong sewing system, we can keep them as such. And of course, we will not restore them to keep the integrity of the volumes.
As you can see from this example, there are points of contact and similarity, not just differences between the two collections. Here, the Cologne context shows books coming from where Van Brol was actually living when it happened. And we also find sometimes exactly the same types of binding with the same elements. This is actually an example from the Van Boegel collection, and it has exactly the same elements of a wraparound clasp here, but also the same system of horizontal support strengthening here on the outside, which you find on some of the books of the Boyk collection. So in other words, you do also sometimes find books which were clearly made probably by the same binders, but for these two very different people. So contrasting collections, yes, but also sometimes very similar elements within them. Thank you very much for your patience.